So I love today's first reading from the Acts of the Apostles. It sort of picks up mid-fight between Paul and some of the Jewish brothers in the diaspora outside the city of Jerusalem. And it's one of the few fights that we have what we call multiple attestation of, because the Acts of the Apostles gives its version of how things go down, and then Paul himself actually writes about it. I think it's in the letter to the Corinthians, but you'd think I would do my homework and actually get the right letter. I forget. Point is, it does exist in his letters because it has one of the best lines that Paul says, and he's got some really good ones, right? So if you were with me, like imagine, because I see everything as though it's a movie, the Acts of the Apostles kind of is like this moment, right? There's a feud, like some conflict is happening, right? We begin chapter 15 with saying there was no little argument among the brothers in the diaspora, right? So there's some issues. And it's getting to the point where they go to Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas, to begin to have, like, let's settle this. We actually need to get to the answer to this because this is causing a problem, right? And then the reading we have today sort of skips over the great sort of Council of Jerusalem, the first council that happens, and sort of gives us an understanding of what really needs to happen. And it's all around this idea of, like, well, what does it mean to be a member of the church? What does it mean? Like, what's the bare minimum that needs to happen? So we also hear today the first encyclical ever written, right? The letter to all the church, this is what you need to do, right? And it's pretty simple. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. Keep the sort of, like, the cleanliness laws around meat in terms of, like, bloodletting in the whole nine, and don't have unlawful marriages, aka don't marry your cousin, right? So, like, pretty straightforward, like, that is the minimum at this point. But I love the Acts of the Apostles because it's all done in this flowery, like, friendly language. Like, you know, Peter stands up and says, I really think they have a point there. And everybody claps. That's excellent, excellent, excellent. And then James, you know, the Bishop of Jerusalem, stands up and says, I think we should let the Gentiles in. And everyone's sort of like, you know, you can imagine that everyone's doing that sort of golf clap, right? Ah, yes, excellent, excellent, excellent. And they kind of go on and on and on. Paul's letter and version of the events is slightly different. And this is what he says. I love it. He goes, I had to confront Caiaphas, that's Peter, to his face and tell him he was wrong. I had to put him right so that he would understand that we cannot hold our Gentile brothers and sisters to the same standard in this reality of what it means to be a member of the way of Christ. Right? And I just, you know, Paul's version is a little bit more real to form, I think. There was a little bit more arguing happening here, right? You know, if you've ever seen, you know, like old school, like moments of great, like, ecclesiastical fighting, maybe you haven't ever watched those movies. You may not be a nerd like I am. That's okay. Right? But in those movies, there's always fisticuffs because, in fact, it did happen, right? One of our favorite saints is St. Nicholas, you know, and the great story that I have is that he eventually slaps another bishop at one of the Council of Constantinople, sort of Nicaea, 331 or something like that, right? So he and them are getting, like, into it because this is an important deal. And if it sounds familiar, if this sort of sounds like, okay, great, now we know that this fight has been going on since at least the first century, we still have camps that try to prescribe what is necessary to be a good Catholic or Christian, right? You know, you have to believe in a certain way, you have to pray in a certain way, you have to do this thing or that thing, right? And this idea of membership sometimes serves, I think, as a distancing tool for people getting more involved in the church. Ooh, I'm not good enough, I'm not a good enough Catholic. You know, I don't do it the right way. I don't have all of my sort of check marks to be a full member of the church. But the reality is, and tomorrow this building is going to be packed. We have a baptism at 10:30 and First Communion, right? And a bunch of second graders are going to participate in basically some of the bare minimum of what it means to be a member of the church, right? Those sacraments of initiation, those sacraments of entering into this process. And they are full members, right? They can participate fully. And the other reality is what is invited in that first reading, that we have to adapt. We have to grow and change what membership means such that it reacts and responds to the reality of that time. Because the first century apostles and the early followers of Christ didn't have 2,000 years of tradition to guide them. They didn't even have the New Testament to guide them. Right? They didn't have this sort of wonderful panoply of great thinkers. They didn't have Aquinas or Augustus or St. Catherine of Siena or Hildegard von Bingen or any of those great saints who can lead and guide us and sort of give us a sense of the tradition. They had the sacramental reality to be that which guided them. In essence, it is the Eucharist that gave them the strength to endure what they endured. They couldn't be consoled by Paul's great words. He hadn't written them all yet. They couldn't be consoled by the story of the New Testament like our gospel reading today, where Christ gives us this great and amazing peace. That could not guide them in that first century, but rather they had the Eucharist, the bread, the body and blood of Christ made present, and that is what allowed them to endure the hardships. That is what allowed them to endure the conflict. That is what allowed them to endure all of the things that they would be persecuted for in the early days of our church. That is the minimum. That is the minimum of our faith. Everything beyond that, we're getting into sort of like good territory or maybe better territory. Maybe there's a better way of understanding this, or, like at this point, we're just sort of getting to brass tacks. We're kind of getting down and doing the work of building any community, right? Because all communities require a little bit of this work, right? It's not just a church thing. Whether you are a fan of baseball or you are a fan of the ballet, like whatever it happens to be, you understand that there are rules and there are ways that that community gathers and sort of has its tradition and its rituals. If you go to a baseball game and you don't stand up at the seventh inning stretch, people look at you weird. And if you don't know the words to Take Me Out to a Ball Game, that's okay, we can teach you, right? Like, we'll bring you in because you know how to do this. Or, if you bring a foam finger to a ballet, like recital, people will also look at you weird. You're not supposed to do that, I found out. Right? So whatever it is, like we create those rules, we create sort of that understanding of how to be members of that community, but the bare minimum in those cases is a desire to be there. And I would say the church isn't much more than that. It is a desire, this sort of sense of wanting to be on the way. That is a path of radical love. Right? And this is the peace that Christ gives us. It's not a peace that the world gives. So it is not peace in the sense it's an absence of hardship or it's an absence of difficulty. That is not what Christ is promising. What Christ is promising is the peace of being united with God at the end of all time. What the peace that Christ is promising is this divine relationship that as he ascends to the Father, another part of the triune God will come to us in the Holy Spirit and be with us forever, and we will have that consolation, not happiness, not easiness, not everything perfect, not everything wrapped up and tied with a bow, but we will have the peace of a divine relationship with God. And so as we enter into our times, fighting and disagreeing about the rules of the church is not new. Right? We have it in our scriptural tradition. We record that moment of the Council of Jerusalem. We record in Paul's own words, like how he felt about that, right? There is disagreement in the New Testament about how that council went down. And I think it serves as a wonderful lesson for us to recognize that the minimum here, what we are asking is our participation in that glory of God, that radical love, that radical invitation to being with God in God's mission. If this not exciting you a bit, because it excites me, because I've seen what happens when people take that mission seriously. They do amazing things. They change the world, my friends. So here's the question. God is inviting each of you to change the world. Are you ready?